Well, welcome everyone. Just a quick introduction. So we're OpenTEAM, Open Technology Ecosystem for Agricultural Management. We're a project of Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and the Environment. So Dr. Lundgren, our dynamic growing community consists of over 35 organizations now and 200 individuals. They're all active across our working groups every month, sometimes on a weekly or daily basis. And so really this in-depth learning series helps build the knowledge base of our community in a way that can foster coherence and collaboration. And each in-depth helps us to collaboratively evaluate new concepts and technologies in an effort to ask better questions and to build better tools through sharing our work. So we seek to address common barriers rather than promote any specific solution. In the pre-competitive space that we hold, we bring together public and private partners to achieve better outcomes, which can accelerate innovation across boundaries. So that's a little bit about us. Today we have Dr. Jonathan Lundgren. He's the founder of the Ecdysis Foundation and also the owner of Blue Dasher Farms. And I'm going to share a recent paper that their team put together. I think years and years of research and a lot of funding went into this on defining and validating regenerative farm systems using a composite of ranked agricultural practices. And so we're going to hear more about that from Dr. Lundgren himself. I'll turn it over to you and anyone from your team. And if, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes, maybe less, with this situation we're in right now. I mean, with you doing field testing today and being in the car, and then we can just open it up for questions. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Okay, 15, 20 minutes, you got it. Thanks for having me here, everybody. I'm heading down to Kansas right now to kind of start filling in some more science gaps and how we assess this transition to regenerative food systems. So I'm sorry I'm not in my best clothes right now, but nevertheless, yeah.
This is real life, you know?
This is real life.
Real work.
So I'm going to share my screen if that's all right, and we can talk a little bit. We have as much info as you want, but certainly we'll try to hit on some high points. And since that paper seemed to be of interest, we can share some of the data that's associated with that. So Ecdysis Foundation is really trying to, we've been around for 5, 6 seasons now, and 2016 was when we opened our doors. And what our goal is realizing that we need this macroevolutionary change to our food system. That touches on many different elements of the food system. And so yes, farmers need to change, and consumers need to change, and a medical field needs to change, but science also needs to change, and we need to adapt how we conduct science so that we are able to use it not necessarily for incremental advances to the current food system, which is, we believe, fundamentally somewhat flawed, but rather how to use science to usher in a macroevolutionary change to our food system. So, in order to do that, Ecdysis Foundation was formed to kind of use science to help fuel this transition to regenerative production. Okay, so this is my farm here. You'll hear a little bit about some of our philosophies here. But really what it's driven by is the farmers themselves. They're changing the way that we see how we produce food. And they are so far ahead of the science at this point that we're just trying to scramble to catch up. And rather than entering into a sphere as the experts, where the scientists are expected to, fill the empty cup, the empty vessel of the farmer with our knowledge, right? Rather, it is a humbling experience of having to relearn what we already thought we knew, because these folks are really challenging our perception of how food should be produced. So really for us, this all began with studies in cornfields. I live in South Dakota. That's where Blue Dasher Farm is. That's our home base. That's the headquarters of Ecdysis Foundation. And we're surrounded by a hell of a lot of corn and soybeans and cows. And if you've ever been to this part of the country, this is ground zero of where change needs to happen. About 10% of the terrestrial land surface of our country is two plant species, corn and soybeans, and all of them are genetically modified, nearly all. All of them are treated copious amounts of herbicides, Roundup, fungicidal seed treatments, neonicotinoids, you name it, chemical fertilizers. And we started working in this, and we said, you know what, we wonder whether or not cover crops could replace pesticide use. Because I'm an entomologist originally by training prior to becoming an agroecologist, and pest management was really on the forefront of my mind. So we got a grant, and the grant said, okay, you're going to work on farmers' fields and you're going to study cover crops. And we're going to see whether or not that helps to reduce our need for pesticides. What do pests do with those things? So we went out to some of the most innovative cover croppers in our region, and we said, okay, this is what you do. You're going to have an experimental design. We need 4 replicates. They're going to be 10 meters by 10 meters in size. We need them replicated in this way. You're going to have, you could select your own cover crops and all of that kind of stuff. And and we started getting all of these questions like, well, I mean, the variety that we use isn't going to be the same as Joe Schmo that lives, 100 miles away from us, and the cover crops that we're using is going to be different. We never use Roundup, so how are we going to maintain this control that you want of bare soil? And the whole experiment crashed and burned. And the reason that the experiment crashed and burned is that I went to the most innovative producers, the ones on the leading edge, and through implementing an experimental design, as I traditionally had on every research farm that I've ever been on, I lost what was special about those farms. And the next season we said, point us to the corn phase of your rotation. And they did that. And then we said, point us to the corn phase of your neighbor who's a conventional producer and tell us what they're doing. And they did that. And we studied those comparisons instead. And the results were really staggering. This was work that was done by Claire Lacan. It's the first time that regenerative agriculture was really tested in the scientific literature. The words had been around, but nobody really tried to, number one, define what a regenerative system was empirically, and number two, compare them empirically with conventional systems. So it was a systems level study. What made it special was that it was best management practices, not as defined by a bunch of scientists, but as defined by the farmers themselves. And number three, it was a regional focus rather than just being on an experimental farm. Practices varied among these different fields, even within a treatment, but principles did not. And the principles were what were driving these systems. A few practices were pretty consistent, though. On the regenerative side, none of these used insecticides. And on the conventional side, all of them did. So we had a nice comparison for bug work. Then we went out there and we got on our hands and knees and sucked all the bugs out of the soil, and we looked at all the insects that were living on the plants, and we looked at yields and profits. The insecticide treated cornfields had 10 times more pests than the regenerative ones. That wasn't supposed to happen, right? Pesticides are important. They're necessary. You can't produce food without pesticides. But these farmers found a way, didn't they? because the pests are never the problem. They're always a symptom. And until we change the way that we think to understanding that fundamentally, we're never going to get ahead. What these farmers did is they changed their system, and they found that when they did, pests were not a problem for them anymore. Yields were equivalent or a little lower in the conventional or in the regenerative farms, but profits were twice as high. Why was that? Because farmers in our area are so focused on yields that they'll spend any quantity of money in order to attain them. And so they were losing money as a result of chasing higher yields. By reducing or eliminating fertilizer use, by reducing their seed cost, and by marketing their products, they ended up having twice as high a profit in the regenerative fields. Indeed, the amount of yield was not correlated with how much profit you were generating. You want to know what was? And nobody, to my knowledge, has ever shown this. The amount of organic matter that these farmers has produced was directly related to the profitability of their operation. We need to be giving prizes not based on how many bushels per acre you're using, but how many percentage increase in organic matter you're generating on your farm. I think we'd see a much different ecosystem. I think we'd see a much different planet. Moved out to almonds, and we saw the exact same things. And I can go into that in length. We're just publishing that study now. Why isn't regenerative agriculture mainstream? If the data is that strong and we're seeing these patterns, why don't we see that regen is taking off? And we do, but not at the scale that it needs to quite yet. Well, I think it's because, in part, it's because science is a little bit corrupted in this regard. It's being used inappropriately, okay? Rather than reinventing systems, science is being used to incrementally solve problems or symptoms in the current broken system. To be a good scientist, what does it take? I was real good at it. I was actually one of the best. I had a whole bullpen of young students and postdocs in my unit, more than 100 peer-reviewed papers. I wrote my first book at the age of 30, millions in grants. I was an advisor to the EPA, the European Food Safety Authority, Brazilian government in terms of regulating genetically modified crops. I was the first entomologist to ever receive a presidential award for being one of the top young scientists in the country from President Obama in the White House. Everything was going right. And then I met these jerks. And what these guys said is they said, the pesticides are killing our bees, John. And I said, no, they're not. The research isn't, I mean, sure, maybe. But the research isn't conclusive on that. It's actually gray. You know, there's some studies that show that it is, but there's other studies that show that it's not. And they said, come on out when they're planting corn and you watch that are coated in insecticides and you watch our bees die in front of the hives. And then you tell us that the science isn't conclusive. And I did. And that changed everything. Because science has to have a human side, doesn't it? It has to have that experiential knowledge. If we are generating hypotheses behind a desk, behind our computers, trying to get the latest sexy grant funded, then we're missing the connection with the problems that we're trying to solve. So we started to show, using our science, that the pesticides were killing our bees, and everything changed. And I went from being the golden boy of the USDA to being sort of a pariah. and they started to suppress some of the science. And at that point, that's not okay. That's never okay. The science was technically reviewed and it was accurate, and they told me to pull my name off of it. And I quit. I quit noisy, because the why are we here? You know, I had to start really asking myself that question. This planet's facing some serious issues right now. And the status quo isn't getting us where we have to go. We need bold action if we're going to save this planet and ourselves. And we can use science to do that. All right. So yeah, I quit noisy. Front page of the Washington Post. When we found out that it wasn't just me who was having my science suppressed. It was only 10% of federal scientists that were having their science suppressed. That's what the report said. 10% is all. And I said, there was 1,000 scientists in USDA ARS. So what you're saying, or 2,000 scientists. So what you're saying is that 200 scientists had their work suppressed for political reasons. So I quit, right? And we started something totally different, grassroots science. What do we need? Let's see. Yeah, we'll pass by us all of that. Lots of things. We need, in order to use science to make regenerative agriculture mainstream, we need to influence policies, and that requires a hell of a lot of data, the kind of data that OpenTEAM is talking about. We need actual practical ways to increase adoption. We need validation that regenerative is indeed superior to conventional in the response variables that we're after. We need to be very clear in what a regenerative system is, and not just hand waving. Oh, I've got a scorecard for regen. There's about 10 of these coming out a year at this point, and nobody's putting data behind them. Nobody's testing these things to see whether they actually work. They're just making you jump through hoops because somebody behind the desk decided that they wanted to decide what regenerative looked like. And then we need to provide roadmaps for success so that farmers can have minimal risk as they move forward. What is regenerative ag? You know, I mean, you see a lot of definitions. I think this is a good one, and there is some science behind some of these definitions now. There's at least 2 papers that have come out in the last year or so that are trying to really nail down what is a regenerative system. But if you ask me, increasing soil health and promoting biodiversity while growing nutritious food with profit, that's a regenerative system. And you can tack on soil carbon and water and your endangered species or your rural community social wellness into that definition. If you distill it down to these 4 things, it usually works, and it usually encompasses a lot of those other elements. I'm a big advocate for parsimony. Balancing precision with function, okay? You developing the most simple approach that gets a job done. And to me, this definition does just that. Soil, carbon, water, farm resilience, all of these things are elements of that. So this is headquarters. It's a farm. It's an operating regenerative farm. And that's one of the ways that we're rethinking science, is that the scientists that we're producing at Ecdysis Foundation have to have firsthand experience being a farmer and a regenerative farmer. So here at Blue Dasher Farm, we produce eggs, lamb, pork, honey is our biggest production. And then we also have half of the farm is native unbroken prairie, which is probably one of the highest quality prairies in the country, I dare say. We've got some really nice plant communities out here. And wetlands. And how to integrate all of those things into orchard and grain systems in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota. Who the heck would have thought? And from this place, we are disseminating, we have active boots on the ground projects validating regenerative systems and developing roadmaps for transitioning in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Nebraska, Kansas, California, maybe Montana this summer, we're going to get up to 1,000 farms doing full site inventories of all soil, geochemistry, carbon down to 60 centimeters, water, microbes, plants, invert communities, birds, economics, on 1,000 farms in order to finally produce the level of data that's required in order to make this concrete bulletproof story that policies can be devoted to. All right, defining regenerative systems. I don't think I have too much time left, and you just holler at me because we probably have plenty to talk about if you need me to, okay? If you need me to shut up. So we developed parsimonious scorecards in order to say, you know, because there is a lot of definitions that are floating around, but at the end of the day, when I walk onto a farm, I want to know, is this one regenerative? And so it really does have to be tied to a practical standpoint. And I'm not an advocate for, I don't get into the whole certification argument or anything like that. As a scientist, I need to be able to compare two treatments. And so we have to be able to define those two treatments. As a result of our attempts to use this scoring system, though, yes, other people can use this for certifying regenerative organic and all of that sort of thing. I think that there is a lot of utility to this approach. Is it the end all be all? No, but it's a heck of a good start. And I think it's where we need to go. So for us in cropland, it's very simple. There's 9 questions, and you've got tillage, agrochemical use, cover crop use, if you're using organic amendments to your soil, how you manage field margins, and whether you're integrating livestock. And these are just yes and no questions. There's one of these systems that's like 52 pages long or something like that. I'm like, no farmer in their right mind is going to be able to, is going to answer this stuff. We have to keep it simple while still predicting the outcomes that we need. In rangelands, it gets even easier. Did you use any agrochemical use? Porons on your animals, herbicides, fertilizers, things like that in your fields. Keep them, high stocking rates, move them frequently, and allow the rest period after your grazing. And if you do that, that gives us a really good predictor of what's going to happen. Just 4 questions. It's got to be simple. It's got to be transparent so that people understand. Untrained, non-experts can understand it. It's got to be transferable among different systems. It's got to be scalable so that it works on small farms, but it also works on the 1,000-acre guys. And it's got to be incorruptible, or you're going to end up what happened to organic, where you have industrialized regenerative that starts popping up. And as a scientist, it's got to be replicable. It's always got to work. So we did that. We tried it. Soil carbons, this is in almonds, just as illustrations, I guess. R squared isn't great, but it's predictive. Soil health scores, this is Haney soil health scores. We want to use metrics that farmers understand and can use, and they can generate themselves. Same deal. As you incorporate more regenerative practices, your response variables that you're after as a regenerative farmer goes up, okay? Plant biomass in rangelands in the northern plains goes up as we start to increase there. Invertebrate diversity, this is in, I believe, almonds or corn. I'd have to go back and find out. Almonds out in California, corn in the upper Midwest. Profit, this is from almonds, ends up going out. But one of the things that we saw as we were starting to look at these, and you can see it real well with the profit here, and it's true in almost every response variable that we were looking at, is that the data ends up forming 2 clouds along that regenerative matrix score. And that wasn't intentional. In fact, most of the farms that we were studying ended up falling along a continuum. But what happens is that you end up seeing these 2 clouds of data. And there isn't a lot of people in the middle. And we think that the reason for that is that you don't survive for very long. You have to choose. Either you go regenerative and you start adopting additional practices in order to attain the productivity of the system and the potential in terms of soil health, biodiversity, profits, and nutrient density ends up going up as a result of selecting that path over the regenerative or over the conventional path, or you have to go back and you stay within that conventional agrochemically minded system. And the potential is lower, but you can survive that way. And that's the way we have survived for a long time. So we can make agriculture conducive to life again. Frankly, we do not have a choice. I get asked frequently from farmers, boy, I love this idea of regenerative, John, but what's it going to cost me? What's it going to cost me to change? I mean, I'm so invested in this dairy. I'm so invested in this equipment for farming 1,000 acres of field crops. How much is it going to cost me to change? And I tell them that's the wrong question. What's it going to cost you not to change? It's going to cost you your farm. It's going to cost you your grandkids. Is that worth it? Only some farmers are going to be alive in 10 years. It's the regenerative ones. So we're going to try to make as many farmers regenerative as we can in as short amount of period as we can. And we have a pretty damn good ground plan for trying to get that done. But it's going to need collaborations with members of your team in order to make it all happen. So with that, we have a growing staff of young, enthusiastic scientists from all over the country. Most of the work that we try to run is funded by donations and foundation support. But if you want to know more about what we're trying to do, follow us on, actually, the Blue Dasher Facebook is probably the most active interface that we have. Christina, my girlfriend, is starting to get Ecdysis Facebook more active, and she's a wonderful image lady. So she's been working on all that good stuff. But drop us a line, look us up. If you believe in what we're trying to do, please support the research. This science is expensive on the scale that we're talking about. Let's keep it as free as we can from corporate interests. And with that, I don't know, I probably went way over, and I'm sorry for that, Laura.
That was perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I know we're gonna have a lot of questions here with this great group, but maybe I will while folks get their questions together. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the 1,000 farms that you're talking about across geographies and farm types. And I think that's really, we have a lot of our hubs here involved, and just love to hear your vision for how we may be able to, how you imagine unfolding this on-farm research and layering that. And that goes along with sort of this broader thing that we've been talking a lot about, is sort of the the overlap of essentially switching science to in situ. So adaptive management, also generating data not just for management, but for research. That's a big sort of part of what's been a large part of this community's conversation. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your vision for participation and how we can, help support generating that high quality data that's both useful for management, but is also asking the big questions together.
Yeah. Well, so we've spent the last 5 years or so automating this process. It's in order to run, this is the largest agricultural experiment that's ever been even attempted, right? To conduct treatment comparisons on 1,000 research units on agriculture across the continent is pretty ambitious. And so we've been sort of developing the methodologies in order to standardize and automate as much as we can, so that we can, at this point, just as an example, we did 30 farms out in Almonds, full soils, water, plant communities, microbial communities were all available to the farmers within a month of us collecting the data. The inverts, we're developing the technology in order to do, and the artificial intelligence in order to identify all of the specimens that we're getting right now. So that level of automation is really where we need to be in order to try to get this done with minimal resources, which is what we're constrained to. Yeah, how do we recruit farms? We're hoping to be working on farms that you guys are working on, but basically, and providing you with data and collaboration in order for you guys to attain your education goals or whatever, or outreach goals, or even your scientific aspirations. We're hoping that that's going to be very possible. And then people are coming out of the woodwork. There's a lot of folks that want monitoring done right now. And so we're able to run at least part of this on a fee for service sort of a thing. Nobody's quicker, faster, or yeah, faster, more comprehensive, more mission focused in terms of ecosystem monitoring than I think we are. So we offer, and cheaper. For $7,500, you get a full system profile within a few months. So yeah, that's how we're gonna do it. 2023 is our goal. We're on 200 farms this year. We're going to try for 500 next year, just ramping it up staff-wise and everything that we need to. For collaborations, we need the word out to as many organizations as we can about what we're trying to attempt. We need partnerships in order to make sure that the data that we're collecting is openly available. And I mean, we're trying to invest in server space and stuff like that, but that's not our expertise. Education programs we love, they're not our expertise. Our expertise is getting the data, and the buck stops here with the science.
Thank you so much. Amanda, you had a question in the chat. Do you want to share that?
Sure. First of all, that paper was really impressive, and thank you for doing that work. I know it's a lot. I'm very interested in the idea of the two clouds, and you know, one group of farmers that has kind of adopted regenerative agriculture in a wholesale way, and one group that has not. I feel like we have a lot of farmers here in Maryland who are straddling a middle line. So they have adopted no-till, they use cover crops, they are still reliant on agrochemicals. And another group is using cover crops and doesn't use, uses organic amendments and doesn't use chemicals, but is still tilling intensively. So I'm curious, and I would say that's the vast majority of farmers that we work with here in Maryland fall into one of those two camps. So I'm wondering where you would put those folks, and if you have any sense at all about how to get them moved over.
Yeah. So that's a very important question. So our matrix, and we've tested this, it's not defined by which of the practices you choose necessarily. Ground cover seems to be a really important one. And so it's a bit of an a la carte menu. And so you can pick, well, if I got to get 5 practices in order to get to a regenerative score, or, then I'm going to pick this one, maybe I'll keep my fungicide use, but I'll get rid of the other stuff, or I'll keep the fertilizer use, but I'll get rid of tillage and stuff like that. What we find, though, is that by selecting the ones that we did, you end up seeing synergistic interactions among these things. Once you go cover crops, for example, or once you stop tilling, you got to have cover on the ground. Otherwise, you're just never going to reach your maximum potential. And in order to maintain that ground cover, well, geez, you can't be using all of these herbicides, right? And so, and you got to figure out, okay, well, if I'm not using herbicide, how do I manage the vegetation? Boy, animals would make a lot of sense in that situation. And so you see these systems sort of evolve. And I think that that's where your clouds end up developing, isn't it? The more, even within the regenerative cloud, the more practices that you incorporate, the more money you're going to make and the more successful you're going to be. And so I do think that that ultimately is going to be the biggest selling point, is the more you use, the better you get. And we're really curious as far as when that data is going to start asymptoting. I mean, maybe, so we'll have a study base that we've been developing over the last couple of years on, I think, 80 or 90 farms, where we've asked them quite a few more management questions. And we'll see whether or not, number one, there's some interchangeability of these things, or whether or not there's some requisite questions that they have to ask. And then we can also use sort of like a stepwise sort of regression analysis of some sort, if you want to use that terminology, to see, okay, you plop this one in, you keep plopping it in. Now we're starting to see soil carbon, after, 10 of these practices are incorporated. Doesn't matter which ones they are, but you always see that asymptote start up. So maybe that's where we can stop using these things. But we'll be able to test that idea pretty darn quick, I think.
So we have
Thank you.
another question sort of related to that. And Steve, I wonder if you want to ask your question in terms of this, that it's a little bit related to that, those two buckets around cost to change.
Yeah,
Help
well,
bridge that.
I guess I noted that you said that the cost of change wasn't really the right question when you're considering whether to change, right? It ends up being perhaps a necessity, but when we're looking at what support farmers might need in order to change, it's still helpful to know, I think, how much money are we going to have, or how much support do people need?
Yeah.
Does your data show that?
It depends on how they strategize that transition, isn't it? And so I tend to be an advocate for not betting it. Regenerative systems, at the end of the day, are so different from conventional farms that I don't believe that simply going no-till in a conventional operation and then maybe plopping in a cover crop, and then maybe every fourth year, grazing it or something like that. I don't think that that's still a pretty conventional system, because it's still maintaining large monocultures. It's not stacking a lot of enterprises, those sorts of things. I'm an advocate for taking a small portion of the farm and adopting a full system, sort of, and then increasing that proportion over time. And under those circumstances, the risk, it's as much associated as with any small business, right? Blue Dasher Farm wasn't profitable. I did the numbers, right at the beginning of Blue Dasher. I'm like, I'm a scientist and I'm really smart and I've got the budgets down. I'm going to make so much money, right? And year 3, we finally broke even. And and I think that that's actually pretty true of a lot of small businesses. And so there's just a learning curve that's going to happen with these. But the nice thing about the current farmers situation is that they have that safety net of their conventional operation that's fully insured and subsidized in order to get them where they have to be, so that they can play around with this new system, which is fundamentally the future of food production.
Great. Thanks so much. I think we've got a couple more questions in the chat. Maybe Rachel, and then followed by Shafali. Rachel, I think you're on mute, or I can read your question.
You mentioned process.
Hi.
It's okay.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, question from left field here about monitoring and measuring regenerative outcomes in apiculture systems. So, you talked about your processes for measuring cropland and rangeland systems. I'm curious to hear what you think the potential to monitor and collect data for regenerative beekeeping.
So we have a pretty active bee research program right now, and we've tried in fact, we just had this discussion this weekend with one of my favorite beekeepers. What does regenerative beekeeping look like? And essentially, I mean, using some of these same ideas, but it really, really matters where you're putting the bees. At the end of the day, the bees are kind of one sort of artifact of a particular habitat. And so what we need is getting the first step in a regenerative bee operation is to find regenerative farmland in order to associate yourself with. And then once you're there, starting to rely, no acaricides, no antibiotics, maybe, it's hard with bees because the quantity of land that these things forage on is 5 miles from their nest. So it's really hard to live in a pristine environment. But just like us, I mean, we don't drive to St. Louis every time we want something good to eat. We try to shop locally first, and so do the bees. And so if you're embedding these bees into a regenerative system, then I think that's the first step. We're actually going to test that idea this year on a pilot study where we're going to have honeybee hives on regenerative rangeland versus conventionally managed rangelands, and then we'll also have some sub-treatments where we're trying to look at microbial health and immune function in the bees under those different circumstances. Great question. It's one that what do you think?
Exactly. It starts with partnerships with landowners. Absolutely. Yeah, and then having contextualized management systems, and so yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm looking at.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So too. Yeah.
I also wanted to ask quickly: are you doing any specific research with on your rangelands how the managed bees will interact with native pollinators in the study that you're setting up?
Yes, actually, we'll be looking for natives as well. We end up, there's this discussion, this dialogue, and even some from certain camps, demonization of the European honeybee, and how hard they've been on native pollinators. And I'm like, boy, you could take a look at the Midwest. It's corn and soybeans, and you're picking on European honeybees about how could be no. Let's put the European honeybee into perspective in relation to our habitat changes and land use changes. And if we change that, you're not going to have any problem. I mean, the honeybees are a drop in the bucket, but yeah, I'm a beekeeper, so what can we say?
Let's go to Shafali for her question.
Great, and I might be going too far in the statistics, so you can also bop this to offline or another. But I was just thinking, I appreciate the presentation, and I was just thinking through the paper and what you were sharing, and kind of, so there's two parts. One is that risks, like the probability distribution and risks, really affect that cost of change. So it's not as binary, right? And it's like kind of weighted, right? And I know that's like going on behind the scenes. But have you thought about kind of explicitly pulling it out a bit more because of the way that that affects decision making? I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Ask your question in a different way, please, and see if I can make sure that I'm answering it correctly.
Sure. So part of kind of when looking at kind of profitability and expected profits, there's so much probability and risk around it, and that's really what's driving it. So there's certain things that are less risky. So even if it's not known, but there's a fairly tight distribution because maybe the farmers are more familiar, or that practice has a much higher chance of working. Whereas there's other practices that are just either going to be much harder, lack of familiarity. So you have a really large distribution, and really those expected profits, that actually changes the math quite a bit, right? Because those expected profits actually are going to look a lot worse. And that's what I think that really comes into play on some of this cost of change, is almost that perceived risk or actual risk that a farmer is taking that's driving that. So it makes it's going to make it more complicated, but it could help in kind of, and that's kind of related to my second question too, around moving to multivariate analysis, because a lot of these relationships are confounded and nonlinear, but that could help in understanding some of the practices that naturally are kind of coming together. And is that something you guys are looking to in kind of future work?
Yeah. What a wonderful question. This is something we contend with a lot. We think about this a lot. I think that the resiliency of a farm is based on its diversity. And so within a regenerative system, within a conventional system, the only reason they're making money a lot of times, most years, is because of subsidization, at least for the vast majority of the acres in the US. Where the resiliency that comes into a regenerative farm doesn't necessarily come from an insurance check. It comes from stacking enterprises and diversifying those enterprises. With Blue Dasher Farm is a great example. I mean, if we didn't have honey production right off of the bat, I was trying to get, annual crops were my thing. That was the world I came in from, and that's what I thought I was going to be producing. It had seemed to have the best value. And the eggs and honey ended up sustaining Blue Dasher Farm for a number of years and provided the customer base that we end up relying on now for all of our other farm products. And so that resiliency ends up being built into a regenerative system based on how many enterprises you stack. So at no point do I ever advocate for somebody to just grow corn. So that's true in regenerative systems as well. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but
it was a very statistical question, so don't worry about it. But
maybe there's a way of thinking. Maybe there's a way of thinking about it where we could test some of these ideas, right? I mean, if you have a certain number of enterprises, or if we've got the livestock angle is kind of there, or maybe we could look into things like crop rotations or something along those lines to see if those farmers are more profitable. Those would be really interesting, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I just think it's like you have so much rich data and information there. So just other ways to kind of pull out and glean out some of the questions that are kind of coming up as you're doing this work. So yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea. As for the multivariate approaches, yes, we are doing that now with the almonds. Maybe I'm a Philistine, I don't know, but I try to use the simplest stats that I can to represent biological patterns in the data. And I know that there's some really fancy dancy stats that really sexes up a paper, but I still rely on t-tests, ANOVAs, and regressions as often as I can. For the almond study that's currently in review right now, we ended up running a PCA in order to try to figure out, whether or not there was some greater things. But at the end of the day, we really want our data to be transparent, and we want, 10, 20 years down the road after a particular, test has kind of run its course, that this is going to be reliable and understandable by as wide an audience as we can. So we try to do both, I guess, is really where we kind of fit into this whole thing. Let me grab a cord here. I need to plug in my computer or else I'm going to die.
Well, maybe while you're doing that, Giselle, would you like to pose your question? We've got maybe 4 minutes, and then we have a closing question that we'd like to pose too.
Okay, thank you for everything. It has been very inspiring. I guess my question is more from the landscape ecology side. I'm interested in trying to understand if there's an ideal diversity of management practices according to the size of the farms, or whether this should be addressed in a more landscape scale, like if for policy making, for instance, there should be an aggregation of the farms and the diversity of the practices should be more linked to the landscape scale, maybe.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering if you were somehow trying to address that question, or if you factored in the area of the farms within this previous study, or yeah, if it was
It is something we're really interested in. I don't have the skill sets on staff yet, but we've got a couple of really progressive grad students who are thinking about those kinds of things, especially when we start looking at birds and stuff. Yeah, they just live on such a different spatial scale. Right now, our experimental units are the field, and so we've been focusing on that. Absolutely, you're right. These landscapes need to be looked at. And especially when we start to think about monitoring our successes. And so that's kind of built into our 1,000 Farm initiative is, I mean, we got to know whether or not what we're doing is working. And so you can start thinking about economics and even ecosystem services on these landscape level scales to show, you know, this changing this handful of farms didn't just change the field themselves, but entire watersheds end up adopting greater levels of cover crops or no-till, or there's a lot more animals on the land, or maybe there's more kids are staying home, you know, kinds of things. Wonderful opportunities there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is exactly what I think. And also, I think it's important to know, for instance, which is the minimum area of a farm according to the number of practices that would be optimal, because I imagine that you cannot partition every farm, you know, up to the limit where you have a very small area, like a very small stakeholder having a 1 hectare and doing a lot of variability there. But as long as you think of the aggregated farms, maybe for small stakeholders, that would work also.
Yeah, we try to hit quite a range of spatial scales within our field sizes, at least. And that does tend to be one of the first questions that we get is, well, how big are the fields that you're working in? And it's like, well, we try to shoot for the average for a particular commodity or crop that we're studying. So in almonds, you know, 10 acres was probably sufficient. In cornfields, we try to go 40 acres, you know, because they tend to be in those size blocks. But, so yeah, there's also a landscape level aspect of it needs to be considered when selecting those field sizes in there. Great project. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lundgren. And I know that there are more questions, including from myself, but the last one we want to be sure to ask you is how, as a community of OpenTEAM and various organizations, hub farms and ranches, tech tools, field methods, oriented scientists, how can we support you and the Ecdysis Foundation?
Boy, I love some of the discussion. If there's ideas for ways that we can expand our impact, you kind of have an idea of where we're going. That would be wonderful. Long term, every single person on OpenTEAM should go out onto a prairie with their shoes off. That sounds ridiculous. The connection that we need to have as scientists to the things that we're trying to change, it's got to be there on a very personal level. And so if I had to pick anything for any of you to do, it wouldn't be give me more money. It wouldn't be give me more scientific expertise. It would be every single person here, get out there and see what it is that we're up against. Experience it, feel it, smell it, touch it. It'll change everything.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think it was a wonderful presentation, lots of great questions, and I think many would share just how inspiring the work you're doing is, and we look forward to continuing the conversation and taking our shoes off and going for a walk.
That sounds great.
In the prairie.
Yep, spread the word, everybody. Take care.
Thanks,
Great.
Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. And I got your question, Crystal. We can ask it.
Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah, just trying to hoping to connect with him. It's a really great presentation.
Yeah, so awesome. Yeah. All right.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye.